Garp has always been a proud Marine and a loving grandfather, but what if the world pushed him too far? How would the world of One Piece change if Garp lost his way and turned evil? As Luffy grew older, Garp began to question everything. He saw the world's cruelty, its corruption, and feared what kind of future awaited his grandsons. With Sabo in the Revolutionary Army and Luffy dreaming of piracy, Garp felt powerless. One day, it all became too much. He told the boys he'd create a better world for them, then left them with the Dan and walked away from the Marines. Garp set out on a final crusade, not for justice through force, but for peace. A child like Luffy could believe in. He would make it happen, even if the world stood in his way. Garp didn't rush. He walked from island to island while wearing his coat with the Marine symbol removed, and he began his quest to make the world a better place. On one small island, he found a warlord charging villagers for water. Garp knocked the man out with one punch and handed out water barrels like candy. On another island, a king was using slaves to build statues of himself. Garp crushed the statues, freed the slaves, and threatened the king into submission. Rumors started floating about Garp that the Marine hero had left the Marines. Some rumors called him a traitor for leaving, while other rumors said that he was still a hero who was going around saving different small islands. No one knew where he'd show up next, but everywhere he went, people smiled after he left, and soon, people began looking for him, hoping to follow. The Marines were not smiling, though, as at HQ, reports were stacking up pretty fast. Reports of destroyed forts, missing warships, and nobles complaining about a crazy old man. Sengoku sat in silence while Tsuru rubbed her temples. Garp had left all of a sudden, which had left a pretty big void in the Marines, and it wasn't good for their image, since he was considered the hero of the Marines. And now this? Sengoku was racking his brain over what he should do, and things were sure to get worse if the upper echelons of the world government found out. He knew he couldn't send someone to forcibly stop Garp, as they'd get their butts handed to them, and Garp wasn't exactly doing anything bad, so he got an idea. He'd send Kuzan to talk some sense into his former mentor, and in case things went south, Kuzan could hold his own, being an admiral. Kuzan soon tracked Garp down to an island by following the rumors. Garp had just scared off a gang of pirates by hurling their captain into a mountain. As he sat on a rock, chewing dried meat, the mist turned colder. Snowflakes were falling, and it looked like the air had changed. Kuzan approached Garp lazily, and Garp sat there eating meat. He asked Kuzan why he was here, and the latter replied that he was supposed to bring Garp back. The Marines weren't exactly happy with their hero going rogue. Garp nodded and said that Kuzan probably had his orders, and that he hadn't trained him to disobey them. So he stood up slowly, and the ground cracked under them. Kuzan sent out a burst of ice, which Garp shattered with his fists again and again, all the while having a huge grin on his face. Each punch made the sky shake. Kuzan tried to freeze the ground, but Garp threw a massive rock at him, and Kuzan had to freeze it. The fight turned loud in an instant. Garp shattered the rock and struck Kuzan hard in the stomach, using hockey-coated fists, which sent him flying back. He stood again, but his breath steamed. Garp taunted Kuzan and said that he'd trained him better than this, and the two went at it again. The fight lasted for a few hours before Kuzan stood there looking much worse for wear. Garp told him that he wasn't coming back and that Kuzan wasn't strong enough to force him. Saying that, Garp just turned around and walked away, leaving only footprints in the snow. Kuzan didn't give chase. He lay back and looked at the sky, mumbling to himself. Somewhere deep down, he understood. After that, more people started following Garp, not out of fear, out of belief. First came an old shipwright who had been kicked out of Water 7 for punching a noble. Then a former cook who fed slaves better food than the officers and got fired for it. Next came a girl who once sailed with pirates, but only stole from the rich. They were all strange, all broken in some way. Garp let them follow him around without explicitly leading as a captain. They didn't really create a flag since they didn't need one. And soon, people began calling his crew the Fist. And soon enough, Garp's right-hand man found him, Bogard. Bogard had stuck with Garp for as long as he could remember, and he realized that his loyalty to Garp exceeded his loyalty to the Marines, and Garp welcomed him with open arms. Years passed as Garp continued his journey, and Luffy was growing bigger under Dadan's care. But Garp's thoughts seemed to be changing. He and his followers kept moving from island to island. At first, it had been only to help, but now it was becoming something more. Like the islands were being judged. He saw towns ruled by pirates who forced kids to beg. He saw Marines who looked the other way for bags of gold. He saw a world that grew fatter on the suffering of the weak, and he stopped laughing. Garp no longer gave warnings. He no longer held back. Pirate crews vanished, and entire ships were crushed like tin. Bases that flew the Marine flag were torn down when they sheltered criminals. Some begged, some ran, but Garp didn't care. He stood in front of Marine bases, stared at the officers inside, and waited for a lie. When the lie came, so did the punch. Steel cracked, flags burned. Some Marines fled when they heard his name. Others started hiding their ranks when they saw his shadow. The old hero was no longer a man. He had become judgment itself. His crew had changed too. They no longer asked questions and followed Garp blindly. Away from him though, unaware to Garp, Luffy had started his journey with a straw hat on his head. He had a dream he wanted to achieve, and he was now looking to form his own crew. A boy with a wide grin and big dreams stared at the horizon like it owed him something. Luffy's adventure had taken him to Shell's Town, where he had found Zoro, and he was going to reach his dream no matter what. Luffy hadn't heard from his grandfather in a long time. He didn't know what his grandpa was up to, but he knew he'd stumble onto him eventually. He remembered Garp's training, yelling, and fists, and love, hidden deep under all that chaos. But as Luffy laughed with his new crew somewhere far away, Garp smashed crashed another base to the ground. They were both moving forward, just not toward the same place. Garp's ideals soon reached the ears of another man who went to meet with the former Vice Admiral. In this timeline, Garp had already started acting independently before Ace's capture. It looked like the Marines were turning a blind eye to the people, so Garp laid waste to an outpost that didn't serve its purpose to protect. Garp stood at the center, staring at the smoking remains of a small fortress when storm clouds began rolling in. The clouds didn't seem natural as Garp looked into the distance. Lightning flashed in sharp, unnatural bursts with the wind, and then the storm formed into a man, Monkey D. Dragon. Dragon walked out from the shadows of the storm and stood in front of his father. It had been a long time since they had met. Dragon had left the Marines and formed the Revolutionary Army years ago, and his father had relatively recently left the Marines too, but they both seemed to have different ideals. Dragon asked Garp if he would join him since they both should have a common goal, but Garp refused. He felt that the Revolutionary Army was too docile, and they weren't doing enough to change the future. Dragon disagreed and said that Garp's way was becoming too brutal, and that destruction and fear weren't how the future would change. The two were getting frustrated at each other, and they soon realized that this wasn't an argument that could be solved with only words. A wave of pressure burst out between them as lightning struck all around them. Conqueror's hockey of an abnormal amount was spewing out from both of them and clashing together like their wills. And then they moved. Dragon raised his hand, and a bolt of lightning twisted down like a spear. Garp rushed forward and dodged as Dragon began sending down more spears of lightning. As Garp closed in, wind wrapped around Dragon like an armor, and he moved faster to clash against Garp. The shockwave crushed nearby trees to splinters. Dragon flew back, landing light on his feet. He lifted both arms, and the storm responded. Rain turned sharp like knives. Garp charged through it without blinking. His coat burned away, steam rising from his skin. They clashed again and again. Dragon's kicks moved like gales, and thunder danced in his fists. But Garp's fists met each one with raw force. No technique, just experience and fury. Dragon tried to lift himself with air. He'd been deftly dodging and counterattacking, but Garp grabbed his leg at this point and slammed him into a cliff. The two were exceptionally strong, but Garp was clearly gaining ground. Dragon got up and the storm subsided. He told his father that this wasn't a path that was going to lead to a brighter future and that Garp needed to rethink what he stands for. Saying that, Dragon just stepped back and let the wind carry him away. Garp stood in the ruins. He'd turned away from his son with clenched fists, but he knew that he had to go further if he wanted the future he had imagined. The world didn't need balance anymore, he thought. It needed correction, and he would be the one to correct it. More time passed, and Luffy had become much stronger than when he started. But unfortunately, he wasn't strong enough yet for the New World, and he found out firsthand how powerful the admirals were on Sabaody Archipelago, and that weakness meant that his crew was separated. And soon, word reached Garp that Ace had been captured by Blackbeard and handed over to the Marines for execution, and his rage was intense. Though the world believed Garp had long vanished, the news of Ace's capture reached even him. He hadn't set foot near a Marine base in years, but family was family. Garp gathered his followers and set sail for Marineford. He'd show the Marines exactly whose family they were messing with. They weren't aware that the man they once called hero would return, not as an ally, but as a force of retribution. Soon enough, Whitebeard arrived with his entire fleet, and the war had officially begun. As the chaos of the war raged on, a surprising new force arrived on the battlefield. Luffy crash-landed with a crew of escapees from Impel Down, and his arrival was shocking for everyone there. Compared to the giants around him, Luffy wasn't the strongest. His power paled in comparison to legends like Whitebeard or admirals who shook the very sea. But strength wasn't all that mattered. What Luffy lacked in raw power, he made up for with unyielding spirit and relentless determination. Blow after blow, setback after setback, he kept charging forward. Slowly but surely, even the hardened warriors of the Grand Line began to take notice. Then the moment came. The execution of Ace was suddenly accelerated, and for a brief, terrifying instant, it seemed all hope was lost. Pirates froze, powerless. But Luffy, in the heat of desperation, unleashed something deep within him. A burst of Conqueror's hockey. Unconscious of what he'd done, he felled dozens with sheer willpower alone, shocking both friend and foe alike. And then another shock arrived as a ship approached Marineford. And in the next moment, something landed on the battlefield like a comet. Garp himself had arrived. Luffy hadn't noticed his grandpa's arrival as he was quickly making his way to Ace. And soon, Luffy reached him. With some help from Mr. 3, Luffy freed Ace, and his brother swooped down in a burst of fire. Garp laughed loudly as he saw his adopted grandson, but then he turned his eyes to someone else. Sakazuki was quickly cutting through the battlefield, and it looked like he was going right for Luffy and Ace. Garp narrowed his eyes and rushed towards them, leaving destruction in his wake. Sakazuki had instigated Ace into a fight, but the Admiral was much stronger. His magma was overpowering Ace's flames. But then, they heard a sonic boom as Garp's fist met Sakazuki's jaw mid-swing. Magma flew as Garp formed a massive crater in the ground, with Sakazuki's head taking the brunt of the impact. Ace and Luffy looked with eyes wide open as they saw Garp, but their hearts soon sank. Sakazuki had tried to rise, but Garp was already on him. Fist after fist, bone after bone. Smoke rose from Sakazuki's body, but Garp didn't stop. He didn't stop when the ground turned red. He didn't stop when Sakazuki stopped moving. He only stood still when he'd been covered in blood, and there was nothing that remained of Sakazuki's head. The battlefield froze, and no one dared move. Even Whitebeard looked on in silence. Luffy stood near Ace, eyes wide, His hands shook, not from fear of the Marines, but from what he had just seen. That was not the grandfather who raised him. Ace grabbed Luffy's hand and pulled him back. They retreated towards Whitebeard as Garp laughed while getting up. He looked towards Sengoku, who was approaching him. Meanwhile, the Whitebeard pirates stood together again. Their numbers were smaller, and their strength had been drained, but Whitebeard gathered them up and they moved together. They pulled back with what was left of their strength. Their mission had ended with Ace free, and so they planned their retreat. Garp had massively turned the odds in their favor, and the loss of an admiral had caused the Marines to become chaotic. But Sengoku wasn't having any of this. His eyes met Garp's as he rushed towards him and transformed into his massive Buddha form. Garp didn't flinch and instead began running towards Sengoku with blood still dripping from his fists, and their clash shook the sea as a Buddha palm met Garp's galaxy impact. Mountains of debris flew into the sky. The air cracked. What was left of the plaza crumbled beneath him. Garp's punches were relentless. Sengoku's strikes came heavy and wide, crashing through stone and steel. Sengoku was raging at Garp for what he had become. It was no longer a battle of justice. It was a fight between two tired legends who used to be friends. Their battle was quickly leveling Marineford, but then the sky split with red lightning as a massive wave of Conqueror's hockey hit the island. Even Garp and Sengoku stopped to look at who had arrived. Shanks had arrived as he jumped off his ship with his crew following. He landed near Garp and Sengoku and locked eyes with Garp. Garp looked at him and dropped his fist. He'd done his job as his grandsons were safe. Shanks proposed that the war be finished, as too much blood had been shed. Sengoku realized that the Marines were in a bad position right now, and any further fighting would cause massive losses for the Marines. This island was close to sinking too, and even the world's strongest man still lived. He agreed to the ceasefire, and the war was declared finished. Garp's bloodlust faded, and without a word, he left the battlefield with his crew following. He wasn't going to let things slide, though. Blackbeard was the one who had put his family at risk, and he would pay for that. Meanwhile, Luffy was recovering on Whitebeard's ship, with his body covered in bandages. In this alternate timeline, Ace was saved, but he felt like he'd lost his grandpa. All that blood surrounding him. He never believed that Garp would do something like that with a smile on his face. He closed his eyes and decided that he would get stronger. Garp had finally tracked down Blackbeard, with his crew and informants working hard to find the warlord of the sea. It took some time, as Blackbeard's crew had scattered after the war, picking up scraps from the chaos, but they left trails. Rumors of islands turned to ash. Towns were swallowed in darkness. Eventually, Garp found Blackbeard with only a few of his crewmates, and that's when Garp would get back at the villain. Blackbeard noticed Garp, and even he shook at seeing the former Marine. He asked Garp why he was here, even though he knew the answer. Garp didn't reply. Instead, he rushed straight for Blackbeard with his crew at his back. Jesus Burgess tried to stand between the two, but a single hit from Garp sent him flying as the rest of the crew went towards the others. Blackbeard was isolated, and so he let out his darkness. But Garp had no devil fruit, and he was once the rival of the Pirate King, and his bloodlust and excessive fighting had brought him back to a power level much closer to that of his prime, and he wasn't about to lose to Blackbeard. The two fought for a while, with Blackbeard sustaining a massive brunt of damage. Blackbeard's body was heavy, tired, bruised. His fruit powers twisted around him, but they were slower now. Garp grabbed him by the collar and brought his fist down, again and again and again. He had no more mercy left in him, and in the end, Blackbeard lay down in a crater. Garp stood over what was left of Blackbeard. His crew watched from behind, silent, as the threat was finally gone. Garp then took Blackbeard's heart, his devil fruit, and ate it himself. No one knew how he survived it. The Yami Yami no Mi was never meant for someone like him, but Garp was no ordinary man. Some say the fruit accepted his will. Others say it was a suicide attempt that failed. Though it was thought to be impossible, Garp had never consumed a devil fruit in his life. His body, hardened by years of war, withstood the darkness, but it was a risk only someone like him could survive. A mass of darkness swirled around Garp as the power of the Yami Yami no Mi went through him. He was growing older, and he knew he'd need more power. What power could be more perfect than the strongest Logia-type devil fruit? Blackbeard wouldn't stand against his grandsons anymore, and he'd make sure that no one else would do so either. Garp turned around and walked back to the ship as Blackbeard's crewmates retreated, unwilling to fight for a dead captain. And soon enough, 2 years passed. During the 2 years, the world began to call Garp something new. An emperor not of piracy, but of judgment. His reputation spread like wildfire, and so did his bounty. He was considered a being of darkness, and everyone learned that he was the one who had killed Blackbeard, considering that he now wielded his devil fruit. But soon after that time skip, Luffy had made a name for himself too. Garp had thought that he'd go after the emperors of the sea soon after, but it looked like Luffy had already beaten him to that. His declaration came after his fight with Kaido and Big Mom. Luffy's devil fruit had awakened, and his power had grown exponentially. But Garp was still on his destructive path, and he was hell-bent on molding the world. He had become known as a tyrannical emperor, and even some of those he saved began to fear him because of how cruel he was to his opponents. No one dared to call him weak. He ruled not with chaos, but with unshakable will. His flag stood for his version of peace. Corrupt Marines had vanished. Pirate crews once feared for their cruelty were now only names on broken tombstones. His bounty towered over all others, and he had carved out a new faction that couldn't really be categorized as a pirate crew. They wore their own uniform and behaved with brutal discipline. They weren't revolutionaries. They were simply enforcers of Garp's law. And now, Garp had decided that he needed more power to overthrow the world world government and establish himself as the true king to ensure a better future, a dream that was now probably too corrupted to be called noble. He'd heard Vegapunk's broadcast, and the fact that the world government had an ancient weapon was reason enough to overthrow them. Garp decided that he'd ally with the giants to get what he wanted, the world government on its knees. Meanwhile, though, as Garp had set sail to Elbaf, Luffy was already close to arriving. After facing off against the elders on Egghead Island, Luffy and the crew had thankfully retreated with the help of Dari and Bragi. Luffy arrived in Elbaf and explored the awesome land of the giants. But things soon took a turn for the worse as the God's Knights arrived. Shamrock and Gunko initially arrived to recruit Loki, the Prince of Elbaf, who had murdered the king. But after Loki's refusal, the God's Knights decided to take over Elbaf instead. More arrived, and soon they kidnapped the kids of the giants to force them into working for them. Luffy was in the Twilight Caverns, a sacred Elbafian crypt said to bridge the boundary between life and legend. And he was helping Loki recover after he'd been messed up by the God's Knights. They didn't know what was happening in the realm of the sun before Chopper and Scopper arrived. Chopper told them that the God's Knights were wreaking havoc, and the worst part was that in this version of events, Emu wielded an ancient devil fruit said to manipulate spirit and will. The transformation twisted the giants' minds and bodies, enslaving them to his power. Coupled with the nightmare creatures roaming around on Elbaf, it was looking like things would only get worse. Hearing about this, Luffy became serious, and Loki started laughing, saying that he'd need to be freed if they wanted Elbaf to be saved. Just then, a massive burst of Conqueror's haki was felt on the island, and then another burst of it was felt, and Luffy recognized this one. Loki was released, and with his power, everyone was thrown back into the realm of the dead, and there, Luffy saw it. Garp was clashing directly with Emu as Conqueror's haki was bursting out in massive waves. Darkness was all around the area, and a bunch of people were dying. Garp himself was battering Emu, who had possessed Gunko as a vessel, and his bloodthirst seemed to be growing by the minute. Luffy awakened his devil fruit and sought to help deal with Saint Summers and save the children. As the battle progressed, Emu's vessel came to the brink. The body began to fail, the power flickering. Unable to sustain the form, Emu withdrew, not defeated but unwilling to be exposed further. He wasn't nearly at his full strength through possession, and he couldn't keep it up against Garp. Meanwhile, Luffy and Zoro, along with Loki, had dealt with the God's Knights. Luffy arrived to see that Gunko had reverted back to her original form, and she was trying to keep herself from getting killed by Garp. Seeing this, Luffy stepped in front of his grandpa and stopped him from dealing the finishing blow. Garp was angered at Luffy suddenly stepping in and told him to move aside so he could finish off the girl. Luffy looked Garp in the eye and refused to step back. Angered, Garp began releasing his darkness, his eyes blood red with rage. Realizing that Garp wasn't going to listen to words, Luffy got into position as Garp launched forward with darkness spiraling around his legs, collapsing the earth beneath each step. His fist came as Luffy hit him with his own, and the sky seemed to split with the clash. Luffy twisted as he spun his body to launch a counter with his leg and hit Garp in the chest, but he had to quickly pull his leg back as otherwise the darkness would nullify his power. Luffy realized that he needed some space and moved back as Garp followed him. Luffy twisted and stretched just beyond the edge of the pull, never letting himself be fully caught in Garp's nullifying grasp. One slip and it would be over. Darkness followed Luffy, but he recoiled and launched another kick across Garp's jaw. But instead of sending him flying, Garp's body absorbed the impact thanks to the Yami Yami no Mi. He gritted his teeth, then responded with a full-bodied punch into Luffy's torso. A pulse of darkness exploded on impact. Luffy coughed out steam as his rubber form lost cohesion for a moment, yanked toward Garp's gravity. Mid-spin, Luffy slammed his palms together, forming a massive, cartoonish hammer from his arms. He brought it down like a storm. Garp crossed his arms, summoning a dense dome of darkness that absorbed the blow, then erupted in a gravitational blast. Luffy caught himself mid-air, and his form flickered for a moment. They continued fighting, with Luffy trying to avoid the darkness as best he could. Thankfully, his powers allowed him to resist the darkness long enough to keep counterattacking and moving out of the way. Luffy was soon running out of gas, though, but it didn't seem like Garp was slowing down. In fact, he seemed to be a wild beast that was completely blinded by rage. Luffy rocketed downward with a fist as large as a mountain, and Garp met it with his own punch. Imbued with Conqueror's haki and the darkness of the Yami Yami no Mi, reality bent, and the ground began to shatter from the impact. Garp roared with rage and pulled Luffy in with a singularity of force. His fist, now encased in both gravity and haki, struck Luffy's stomach with earth-shattering force, and Luffy's body seemed to fold around the punch as his hair suddenly went back to normal. In a flash, he was above his fallen grandson, arm raised once more. Shadows swirled madly behind him like a storm of regret. Zoro and Sanji saw this and rushed towards Luffy. They were too far away. Garp was about to smash Luffy's face with his fist when suddenly he remembered what all of this was for. Wasn't this boy the reason why he started all this? The darkness suddenly faded in a flash, and Garp lowered his fist before looking at his hands. What was he doing? How far had he fallen that he would hurt his own grandson? Had he devolved into a wild beast? Garp began crying and apologizing profusely while lifting Luffy up and cradling him in his arms. He had fallen so far in his quest to change the world that he had become what he hated. Luffy touched his grandfather's face and quietly asked him whether he was done hitting him with his fist of love, and Garp held him tightly, crying and apologizing for what he had done. Luffy soon recovered, and Elbaf was safe from the threat of the God's Knights, at least for the moment. But gladly, Garp had come back to his senses. He had realized that he'd strayed from his path, and he needed to make it up to Luffy, somehow, and he would eventually standing next to his grandson to fight against the real enemy, the world government. Make sure to subscribe and smash the like button for more One Piece videos.